Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. This episode of Recorded Content features me and Tristan Pelligrino, my business partner at Motion and the co-host of Recorded Content. What do people want? They want a smooth experience for their guests so that they can get the best content for their audience. We both wanted to jump on and tackle a big problem we see with B2B podcasts. The need for, or lack thereof, of a pre-flight checklist. There's nothing worse than getting someone's name wrong or spending 20 minutes fumbling through getting someone's mic to work before you hit the record button and jumping into the episode frustrated. It's important to remember that B2B podcasts are not just chit-chatty conversations over Zoom. Your podcast is a reflection of your company and of your company's brand. You need a plan for each episode, and that plan begins before you ever hit the record button. So Tristan, as we get started here, as a B2B podcaster, how important is the experience for the guest?
Yeah, the guest experience is important because it really impacts the perception that your guest has with your show and in your company overall. I mean, it demonstrates the level of care that you take with your show. So basically, if you could think about your podcasting experience for your guest, I mean, that's really an extension of your brand. So as a podcaster, you want guests to really have the best experience possible, because that's what they're going to talk about, in their LinkedIn post. What was their experience like? That's what they'll also mention to colleagues or other folks in the industry. And this really starts to take hold when you start creating more and more episodes and you really start to get that library of content and those relationships in place. If you have that positive guest experience all the way through, it's really just going to help you long term.
And I know that one of our favorite things in the world is people coming on this very show and sending feedback to us that it was the best podcast experience that they've ever had. And I mean, it's a high bar a lot of times because these are folks in the podcast space, from podcast tech companies that run their own podcasts or B2B podcasters themselves. And they talk about how smooth it was to how sweet the assets are that we create afterward. And that entire life cycle that we're laying out, starting with the pre-flight checklist, leaves everyone with a positive feeling around our brand afterward. So my question to you is, what's the biggest thing that you've seen that prevents a great guest experience from a podcast?
Yeah, the biggest thing standing in the way. Sorry, let me start that over. The biggest thing standing in the way of a really good, positive guest experience is just a lack of preparation. So when you're a podcast host, you have to think about that there are a lot of things that you can avoid during a recording session. A lot of those technical issues that you encounter quite frequently, those can all be alleviated if you prepare and you share information with your guests beforehand. So why aren't hosts and guests prepared? I mean, let's look at that for a second. I mean, it's often because they don't have a system in place. So in order to be prepared, it's silly to think about, but you need a system. You need a checklist of things to go through. And as you encounter issues, you can always modify the checklist or add an item to the checklist to prevent an issue in the future. So when I think about preparation, just for the experience itself that your guest has with your show, I really break it down into two parts. The first is informing your guest up front and setting expectations before you ever hit the record button. That's important. That's step one. And the next one is going through a pre-flight. And the next one is step two, and that's going through a pre-flight checklist that you mentioned. And And that happens, that sequence that you go through, those different items that you go through all happen before you ever hit record.
And it's so important that you stick to them. I've seen on so many occasions that people will have these pre-flight checklists in place, and then the second that something goes wrong, it's, oh, don't worry about your lighting, or, okay, we'll just jump on to Zoom. Setting those expectations and making sure that you stick with them. So if we're talking about these expectations and what they are specifically, Tristan, what's involved with setting expectations with a guest before recording?
Yeah, so before you ever jump into Squadcast or Zencast or whatever platform that you've selected to do your remote recording, let's just think about what information to share with your guests beforehand, whether that's in an email or during a conversation. There's a couple things that I like to think about here. First is you need to share with your guests what the podcast is about. So even if you've secured a guest and they're on board with participating, it doesn't guarantee that they really have a full understanding of what you're trying to accomplish with your show. So when you think about sharing that information, it might be a theme statement that you create, which is often what we lean on heavily for ourselves and our customers. But it might simply be the description or the podcast show summary that you already have in place that's visible on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's a good thing to share with people so that they understand what the show is trying to do, like who you're bringing on as guests, what information you're trying to cover, and how you're trying to help your audience. The second big thing to share with your guests beforehand is the core idea that you want to explore. You know, what is that conflict? What is that element that you're going to explore throughout the episode? You'll often hear a lot of different opinions as to whether you share the full list of questions beforehand or if you share anything at all. I'm a big believer in sharing the big idea that you want to get across, because that guarantees that the guest comes on to your recording session and they have that mindset, right? They're kind of, their gears are turning already in that direction. And in my opinion, that helps out quite a bit. The third big thing is to provide a picture of what the experience looks like. So what happens, if I'm a guest, what happens after I appear on your show? You know, where does the episode go? How is it distributed? What content comes out of the recording itself? So if you can provide that picture for your guest, it gets them excited. It gives them an indication as to, hey, if I invest time in this recording session, I appear on this podcast, I have a good idea of what it's going to look and feel like afterward. And that contributes to just an overall positive experience. And then the last big thing to share with your guests beforehand is just the logistics of the recording session itself. So you would be surprised how many people don't know whether it's a video or an audio only recording. That's very important to lay out up front because sometimes people aren't camera ready when they show up when they thought it was an audio only episode. And that's a difficult situation to navigate when you already have your time set up and your recordings in place and everyone shows up and the person's just not ready to be on camera. Another big thing is, how long does the session typically take? So at Motion, and what we advise a lot of our customers to do is to use a calendar invite, block off that time, and build in enough leeway on the front and the back to make sure that you don't go over that allotted time. So quite often we use a full hour. We'll have some time built in up front to go through our checklist, our pre-flight checklist, and then we'll have some time in the back just to go over what distribution looks like, what the workflow looks like, and timing and so forth. And all that is covered within a single hour. So we make sure that the guest knows that up front. The next thing is what platform is being used. So if you're using Squadcast, Riverside, what have you, it doesn't guarantee that your guest has experience with that platform. And as we all know, when you have technology, some people are very familiar with different user interfaces and some are not. So it's important to just let the guests know what platform you're going to use beforehand. And then lastly, what equipment do you need to ensure a high quality recording? And at a minimum, we suggest having a very solid internet connection in place. It's not really equipment, but it's connectivity that's involved. The next big thing is having a dedicated microphone. And then lastly is a set of headphones. And that helps ensure that you don't get mic bleed or this echo that goes across in your recording platform. And that guarantees that you have the best sound possible that's recorded.
Yeah, and the way that we do this is we create this guest guidelines document that encompasses all of these items: how to use Squadcast, what the show is going to be about, what the typical episodes are, so on and so forth. Now, pointer here, it is great that we send over this nice PDF that walks people through exactly how an episode is going to work, and then you get on C-level executive onto your show, and they spent no time reviewing it. So the workaround that I've done is I definitely recommend putting together that document, making it very clear, easy to understand. But what I also do is in the email that I send over with that as an attachment, saying, hey, please review this, is also I send in bold the things that are absolutely mandatory that somebody knows, so that I know at least my odds are higher that they'll review that. So for me, the things that I send over in bold are, hey, I need you to have some decent internet. 5 megabytes per second ain't gonna cut it. I need you to have 30 megabytes per second or more internet, and I need you to have headphones with a mic on them, as Tristan mentioned, for a variety of reasons. Limited, not limited to, I've had people who have recorded on computers and the microphone on their computer is sitting next to the fan. And then it's, hey, can we get rid of that fan? Well, no, it was captured on the audio. So whatever those very important things are, I recommend outlining them in more than one place to ensure that they're seen. So once you have the guest join your recording session, can you talk about the importance of the pre-flight checklist and what goes into it?
Yeah, so the pre-flight checklist is helpful. And I mean, you can even take a step back and think about it literally before you jump on a flight. I mean, a lot of folks haven't been flying a lot in the last year and a half or so. But if we think about those cases where a pilot goes through before they take off, there's a systematic way of going through all the different items to make sure that you are set to go before you get out on the runway and take off. And the same thing is the case with your podcast recording session. So what I do, and Justin, you might be a little different, but I just have something pulled up on my laptop. I have bullet points out there, and I just go through one by one before I hit the record button. And that's my take on it there. I mean, you can have a handwritten note, whatever your system is in place. The big thing, like you mentioned, Justin, is to be consistent with it and to make sure that every time before you hit the record button, you're going through these things to set you up for success when you record. So here's really what's included in my pre-flight checklist that we use in Motion. The first is to confirm a stable internet connection. And that's important because, especially if you're recording video alongside audio, recording HD video requires a lot more bandwidth, and it's more complex from a technical perspective. So if you have a very weak internet connection, you might get a lot of different issues that result from that. That could be just lost video altogether. It could be drop frames. There are a lot of things from a quality standpoint that are impacted if you don't have a good, stable internet connection. And the one thing with Squadcast, which is the platform that we use, is they have an indicator right there within the platform that lets you know what your internet connectivity looks like. And so if someone has a very unstable internet connection, then that puts you in a situation where you might have to reschedule. If they're in an environment that just doesn't have a good connection, then you might have to get another session in place to make sure that you get the quality you're looking for. The next thing is people don't really think about this when they're recording audio and visual content remotely, but it's important to close out from your browsers and to really reduce the load that's on your machine when you record. So because a lot of times you'll have background processes in place or some other activities going on in the browser, and that just really puts a lot of load on your system, and it can impact the recording session as well. So we encourage folks to really just open one browser window with your recording platform, and that can help out a lot as well. The next thing is to just test your microphone and your headphones and make sure that the guest is recording with the right microphone and they have the headphones in place and everyone can hear each other very clearly. The one thing that I've done in the past is I've recorded with the wrong microphone by accident because I was in a hurry and I recorded with the onboard mic of my laptop and I didn't use the nice microphone that I had set up, and the quality was subpar. And that creates an interesting situation in post-production, so you don't want to do that. The next thing is to confirm really what's in the frame. So if you're doing a video podcast, you want to confirm what you can see behind the person. The worst thing is if you have something behind you that isn't going to be totally appropriate, or if it's going to be distracting, those are things that you want to avoid if possible. So it's almost like if you're shooting video on site. You don't want something in the frame that's going to be distracting. And the same thing is with a remote situation where you want to make sure you don't have too much clutter in the background or a big bright window that's going to really create a silhouette effect. All those are things that you need to factor in when you're going through your pre-flight checklist. The next thing is to restate or clarify what the episode is about. So we talked about sharing the big idea with your guests beforehand, before you jump on the session. Well, what I like to do is just restate that for the guest again and say, hey, what we're going to talk about today, like I listed in our guest guidelines, is here's the outline of the show. Do you have any questions, or is there anything else that you've thought of since we shared that? And that just ensures that you as the host and the guest are on the same page, and they have their mind in tune with what you're going to discuss during that recording session. Another thing that is interesting to forget is confirming the guest's name, company, title, and making sure that you're able to pronounce everything correctly. The worst thing to do is to get on a recording session and to start off by stating their name wrong, or listing the company name with .io after it when they typically don't refer to their company with a .io after it. Another thing too is to confirm their title. Sometimes people don't always update their LinkedIn profile the day after they get a promotion, and sometimes people will have 3 or 4 different titles and you don't know what the hell to list as their title. So if you ask all that up front, it ensures that all the assets and everything that you build on later, that they're correct and you don't have to make those adjustments. Another thing is I go through the list here is to ask the guest if they have any questions before you get started. So once you've laid everything out, you've gone through your checklist, open it up to them. Do they have any questions? Is there anything that you didn't cover that they're worried about, or they're wondering before you get into the recording? Give them that opportunity. A lot of times you'll alleviate any concerns or any doubt with the process just by asking that question. And then lastly, if you do have any major issues or technical complications, the best thing to do is to reschedule and troubleshoot those offline. It becomes very difficult, and Justin, I'm interested to hear your perspective on this, but it becomes hard to get into a really good recording session and to have your mind right if you've spent 20 to 30 minutes troubleshooting an internet connection or a mic or a headphone issue. If you've gone through all that and it hasn't really worked out quite well, then it's very tough to have a positive conversation. So it's best to just figure out the problem. Then if you do, then hey, let's reschedule. That way we know what the issue was. We won't encounter that issue next time, and we'll have a better state of mind once we hop on. So that's how I like to think about the pre-flight checklist. But Justin, anything else that you can think of that you incorporate as well?
No, I actually really like that So I'm a little bit more reactive, I think, than proactive. So I think that's something that I'm going to actually take away from this. I have my checklist of things to do to troubleshoot when things aren't working. And I think that can come off as me almost like correcting the guest and saying like, oh, you didn't do this correctly. Let me help you to troubleshoot. And I think if you go in with this pre-flight checklist, like, hey, I'm just going through my my steps that I go through with everybody. I actually really like that. And I think that that's something I'm going to take away and do. Hey, instead of your internet seems slow, it's, hey, I'm just going through my process and I want to test your internet speed. Oh, your internet I'm just going through my process and your internet speed seems like it might be a little slow. Can we move your computer or something like that? Versus me telling them that they're almost doing it wrong. So I really appreciate that. And then on that last point about major issues, I've just seen it for myself and for clients as well, where you have this guest that you're excited about and you don't want to have to reschedule with them, but you spent 20 to 30 minutes trying to get their microphone to work or their connection to work or something along those lines. And so you're like, all right, let's just jump in. And then instead of getting 30 to 45 minutes, you end up getting 15 minutes. They never open up, and that was your one chance. Don't be afraid to say, hey, look, I don't create the software, the technology that we're using. I'm doing my best here. I'm not a professional producer. Let's try and get this figured out. Maybe we can get someone from IT on your side involved, and let's just reschedule, and we can both take a breath. And what I've also seen happen is when you do jump on that second recording session, it's good for a good laugh, like, man, that was that was frustrating. I'm glad to be here. I've kind of shaken it off a little bit. Kind of funny we both had to deal with that versus, all right, let's power through, and we're both frustrated because dealing with technology that is not working is frustrating. I don't care how much you love technology. It is not fun trying to figure out why something isn't working, especially when you're on the clock with, we have an hour booked and we're at a half an hour, and usually my show is 45 minutes. So don't be afraid to say, hey, we're going to cut our losses today. It's okay. Let's pick this up next week. So love that, and love being proactive versus reactive and coming in and saying, hey, let's work through my list. And if something's wrong, we can identify it. I think that is going to be a good place to stop. We've covered quite a bit regarding the pre-flight checklist, and the most important thing to remember when going through all of this, because it isn't fun sometimes to say, what's your internet speed, or I asked you to get headphones, but you didn't get the headphones. It all goes back to ensuring that the guest experience is a great one, and when they go to listen, that uncomfortable question that you asked for 2 seconds for them to go get headphones even though they didn't have them led to them hearing the audio and loving what they heard versus having audio that wasn't great. So just remembering that all of this goes back to a great guest experience. That's all we have for this week's episode of Recorded Content for Tristan and myself. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.